In this unit, we're going to discuss Active Directory sites and replication, and these two topics are interrelated in that replication has to happen between sites. So it's important to define sites correctly and efficiently in order for replication to work the right way. So we'll talk about both topics in this unit. So first, let's talk a little bit about sites. So an Active Directory site is a physical location where domain controllers are placed and group policies can be applied. So we talked about a site being an Active Directory object, and whenever you have an Active Directory user or computer, it can have a site based on where they log in from or where the computer is located, which is typically determined through an IP address. So you can place a domain controller physically near accounts using it, which makes a lot of sense because it's a lot more efficient. So typically when you have multiple sites, you want to make sure that each site has a domain controller located at their site, and we'll talk about some various ways to do that, but you want to make sure that there's a domain controller there because it's going to make it a lot faster for them to utilize network services on the domain if they have a domain controller that's local. Logon, for example, can take quite a bit of time if everyone in a particular office is logging in at the same time. If you had 1,000 users all trying to log in at 8 o'clock every morning, it might be a little bit slower, when everybody comes in, although it might be okay, perhaps the rest of the day. So, but it's relatively inexpensive to locate a domain controller at a remote site, if for no other reason than to ensure the efficiency of using Active Directory at a remote site. So the first domain controller of a forest creates a site name default first site name once it's installed. So there's three main reasons that we establish multiple sites. One is authentication efficiency, which I just discussed. It'll be a lot more efficient for authentication if each location has a domain controller in close proximity. Replication efficiency, because not only do we have to reach out to a domain controller to do authentication, but domain controllers also have to replicate between one another. And having sites and defining sites can make replication a lot more efficient. You certainly don't have to make sites. Theoretically, if you set up Active Directory on a network interconnected through VPNs, theoretically it'll work if you don't create sites, but it makes it a lot more efficient if we use sites and we define how those links between different servers work. And also for application efficiency. So here in this screen, you can see we have here three different sites, right? So we have between DC1 and DC2 in Chicago and New Orleans, we have a high-speed WAN link. But between Chicago and New Orleans, we also have a slow WAN link in the picture on the bottom. So it would be important for us to know that a connection between two domain controllers is either a slow or a fast connection. And that'll help determine how replication works. So a site is linked to an IP subnet that reflects the IP address scheme used at the physical location that the site represents. Theoretically, you can have more than one IP subnet at a site. But you can see here in this example, at the main site, we have 3 subnets, and at that remote site in New Orleans, there is 1 subnet. And we can define that there is a slow WAN link that interconnects these two networks. So some of the components in a site: you have connection objects, which is an Active Directory object that defines the connection parameters between two site replication partners or domain controllers in the same site. And they're generated automatically by the knowledge consistency checker. And then subnets are, each site is associated with one or more IP subnets, and a subnet can be associated with a single site. So basically when you configure sites, you basically define a subnet and you assign it to a site in Active Directory. So you would create all of your subnets, and you would assign, or you would attach those subnets to the sites to which they belong. That way, Active Directory knows which site or which computers at which site based on the IP address scheme that it's using. So a site link is the connection between two sites. So a site link is needed to show Active Directory, to tell Active Directory how two different sites are going to be connected. Is it a fast connection, a slow connection, and which ones should be connected. In other words, let's say you have a hub and spoke style network. You've got one centralized facility that hosts a couple Active Directory servers, and then you've got remote offices sort of splattered around that facility. You would want to maybe define site links between the hub and each spoke, as opposed to having site links between the various spokes, because those connections may be much slower between those spokes. So again, it helps to understand what your network topology is, to know how it, what makes the most sense with your site links. And you would also determine the replication schedule and the frequency between two sites. Obviously, if you have a slow WAN connection, you would do less frequent replication to save on bandwidth. A bridgehead server is basically the server that's designated as sort of the intermediary for these connections between different sites. In other words, if I had 5 domain controllers at site A and 5 domain controllers at site B, I probably don't want all 5 communicating with each other over the site link. Instead, I would want one server at each site to communicate with each other and then disseminate those replications to the servers on each side. That way, we're cutting down on the amount of traffic. We don't need sort of a storm of replication happening across the entire network. So that's what a bridgehead server does for us. You're basically designating one of your domain controllers as the bridgehead, which is essentially the intermediary for all of these replication, for all this replication that's happening. So in the next couple slides, I'm going to talk about configuring sites. We'll talk about how to create sites, configuring the site links that I talked about, and registering the SRV records. I'll talk about what those are, and working with automatic site coverage, and then finally how to move domain controllers between sites. You might have to move a domain controller, so you have to make that domain controller aware that it's now in a new site. So let's start with creating sites. So sites are usually geographically dispersed and connected via WAN links. So when you create a site, you're asked to select a site link. In other words, so when you create a new site, you have to tell it what site link belongs to that site. And the default site link is the only choice unless you've created additional site links, which of course is advisable. You'd want to create those additional site links. So after you create a site, you have to associate it to subnets. So you would define which subnets belong to that site. So Active Directory will use that information for placing new domain controllers in the appropriate site and determining which site a client computer belongs to. Again, all based on the IP address that is obtained by that client. We'll talk more about how this can integrate with DHCP later on in the course. In a couple weeks, we're going to talk about some advanced topics with DHCP and DNS. And of course, SRV records will come up again as well. So if a client's IP address doesn't match a subnet of any of the defined sites, then the communication efficiency could degrade because the client could be making requests to remote sites because you're going to lose that, Active Directory is going to lose that intelligence as to the location of that client if you haven't configured these sites. But it will work. You can do that. If you do have a site that's not configured within the subnet, it just won't get assigned to any particular site. So site links have 2 main configuration options. There's the cost, which is a value that you define. So this is a metric of how fast that connection is. So this helps Active Directory determine the most efficient path to do site replication. So the value can be altered to influence which path is chosen when more than one path exists. So it's sort of a metric, just like a routing metric when you look at routing protocols, perhaps in your network courses. And then you define the replication of frequency using that site link. And it can be, the default is 180 minutes, 7 days a week, but you can specify less frequent updates if you like, based on the speed of the link. So for example, I might have 4 sites, and I could define various site links. So here in this example, we have 3 site links that have a metric of 200, and one that has a cost of 100, the one between site B and site D. So Active Directory might determine that it makes more sense to replicate between site B and site D by going through A and C. So A and C would replicate to B and C, and there would be less frequent updates between B and D directly. So if somebody makes a change in site C, it gets replicated to A, which gets replicated to B, and also gets replicated to D from site C. So again, the cost on those metrics can sort of define the most efficient way to carry out those replications. And this is the dialog box where you would configure your site links in Active Directory. An SRV record is so if you recall from DNS, you have A records, quadruple A records, MX records for mail. So just a quick review of DNS. DNS is sort of like the phone book of the internet, right? So when you're looking for an IP address from a name, you do a call to DNS. You say, here's a name that I'm looking for. Give me the IP address, and it comes back and gives you the IP address. And that's a simple example of an A record. If you want to send mail, then you do a query for an MX record for the mail exchanger. If you want to, if you want to get the IPv6 address, you do a query for the AAA or the quadruple A record, the AAA record. So different types of records, but in Active Directory, there's another type of record called an SRV, which is sort of an open-ended record where you can put additional information. But this is how a client on an Active Directory network gets information about where it can contact an Active Directory server. So if you have a computer that turns on and gets an IP address, one of the things that it can get, if it's a member of a domain, one of the things it's going to look for when it does DNS is the SRV record that tells it how to get to a Active Directory server, to a domain controller. And it'll, hopefully the SRV records will list multiple domain controllers. So the reason this is important with sites is because when somebody connects to a network with DHCP and gets the DNS address and then queries DNS, it's going to tell it where the domain controllers are that are most appropriate for it to use. So if you're using DNS with Microsoft Windows and it's integrated with Active Directory, it should provide a SRV record that gives a client the most appropriate domain controller to connect to for the site at which it's located. So if a DC fails to register as SRV records, you can force it attempt to register by stopping and starting the net logon service in the service's MMC. But when a server registers as SRV record, it should be able to tell the DNS server which site it's located at. So this is what the SRV records are going to look like when you look in Active Directory. You can see here these are various servers that are registering its SRV records. In other words, telling the clients where they can connect to use Active Directory services. So automatic site coverage is a feature where each domain controller is going to advertise itself by registering SRV records and DNS in sites that don't have a domain controller if the advertising domain controller has the lowest cost connection to the site. In other words, this is how we automate the process of users in a given location having the access or automatically accessing the most appropriate domain controller for their particular site. So if you have Windows Server 2003 and read-only domain controllers in any sites, you're going to disable this feature because the servers do not consider RODCs when they're evaluating site coverage. In other words, remote read-only domain controllers with 2003, if you're in 2003 functional level, when somebody when a client workstation checks to see what's the most appropriate domain controller, they may get read-only domain controllers that are not at their site in addition to other domain controllers. So you may want to disable this feature because it sort of defeats the purpose of having sites at that point if it's going to query over a slower WAN link anyway, because it wouldn't understand that it's not at the local site. And finally, once you have these sites set up, you may have a need at some point to move a domain controller from one site to another. So the basic procedure for moving a domain controller to a new site, first you're going to verify the target site is created and has the right subnets assigned to it. Then you're going to change the domain controller's IP address, subnet mask, and default gateway as needed for the target site. So basically change the IP address for the new site that it's going to be located. If the domain controller is used as a DNS forwarder, make any necessary changes in the forwarder configuration because it's going to be in a new subnet. If the domain controller hosts a delegated DNS zone, you're going to update the NS records for that as well. We're going to talk more about those previous two items I just talked about. I will discuss those in more detail in the section of the course where we cover DNS and DHCP. And if the domain controller is being moved is a preferred bridgehead server, you have to make the adjustments in both the current site and the target site to designate that as the bridgehead server. So that's another thing you have to make sure if you're going to make this a bridgehead server. And in some cases, this may be the first domain controller that you're locating at a site, which would explain why you're going to make that a bridgehead. Obviously, the first one would probably be the bridgehead. And then you're going to move the server to the target site in Active Directory Sites and Services. So you have to go into AD Sites and Services and basically move that server into the new site in which it's going to get located. And in the DNS Manager, you would verify that the SRV records are created in the target site folder, so that you should see in the correct site folder that it's now registering itself at the correct site. And that's it. So in the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about Active Directory replication. So we talked about the sites and that's how that's important for replication. But then we'll talk about sort of the more practical uses of replication in the next slide deck.